For decades, the Beckham family has existed as something more than a household. They've been a symbol, a carefully managed idea of success, ambition, and unity that felt almost untouchable. David Beckham, the global football icon, Victoria Beckham, the pop star turned fashion powerhouse, together they presented a version of family life that felt aspirational, polished, and relentlessly put together. From the outside, it looked seamless, but for those born inside that image, especially the eldest child, the cost of maintaining it may have been far higher than anyone realized. Brooklyn Beckham grew up in full view of the public, long before he could choose whether he wanted that visibility. While his younger siblings were gradually shielded, Brooklyn was introduced early as the next extension of the Beckham legacy. The expectations weren't subtle. There was an unspoken assumption that greatness would be inherited, that talent would transfer seamlessly, and that the family name would continue forward without disruption. For a child still figuring out who he was, that pressure didn't come with space to fail quietly. The first attempt at shaping Brooklyn's identity followed the most obvious path: football. He was placed into elite youth systems, surrounded by children who had been training for that world since they could walk. But unlike his father, Brooklyn didn't thrive there. The comparison was unavoidable, and eventually the opportunity ended without the progression everyone expected. What made that moment especially heavy wasn't just the loss of a career path, but the realization that he would always be measured against a standard he never asked to set. Instead of being allowed to step back and recalibrate, the spotlight simply shifted. When Brooklyn showed interest in photography as a teenager, it wasn't treated as a phase or a hobby. It became a headline. Professional platforms opened immediately, including high-profile fashion opportunities that most experienced photographers wait years for. The public response was brutal. Accusations of nepotism followed instantly, and the criticism wasn't just about access, but about readiness. The gap between opportunity and experience became impossible to ignore, and before long, that chapter quietly disappeared. The same pattern repeated itself when he explored cooking. Rather than attending culinary school privately or developing skills off-camera, Brooklyn's interest was once again turned into content. Social media clips, branded moments, and public scrutiny followed him into a space that should have been personal and developmental. Instead of learning, he was performing. Instead of growing, he was being judged. Over time, it became clear that Brooklyn wasn't struggling because he lacked ambition, but because every attempt at self-discovery was immediately absorbed into the Beckham brand. That brand, often praised for its discipline and consistency, relied heavily on presentation. Family moments were public moments, support was visible support, affection was documented, and success wasn't just measured by achievement, but how well it fit into the larger narrative. For someone like Brooklyn, who hadn't yet found a stable sense of identity, this environment made authenticity feel risky. There was always an audience, always a consequence, and very little room to exist without interpretation. Then came Nicola Peltz. Their relationship introduced a new dynamic into an already tightly controlled ecosystem. Nicola didn't come from the same kind of celebrity branding machine, but she did come from immense wealth and influence of her own. That difference mattered. For the first time, Brooklyn was closely aligned with someone who wasn't dependent on the Beckham name, someone who didn't need access, and someone who couldn't easily be absorbed into the existing hierarchy. Almost immediately, speculation began about tension, especially between Nicola and Victoria, though nothing was said publicly at first. As Brooklyn and Nicola grew closer, subtle fractures began to show. Social media patterns changed, appearances shifted, moments that once would have been automatic suddenly felt conditional. To outsiders, it looked like distance. To those paying attention, it looked like the beginning of a quiet separation between a son and the image he was expected to uphold. And by the time wedding plans entered the picture, the pressure that had been building for years was no longer contained beneath the surface. By this point, Brooklyn wasn't just navigating family dynamics, he was navigating power, image, loyalty, and independence, all while the public continued to see the Beckhams as a flawless unit. The contrast between that polished exterior and Brooklyn's internal experience was growing sharper, and the cost of staying silent was starting to outweigh the risk of speaking up. What had once been presented as support was beginning to feel like control, and the foundation of the Beckham family narrative was quietly starting to shift. By the time Brooklyn and Nicola's wedding approached, the underlying strain within the family was no longer subtle. What should have been a unifying milestone instead became the moment where years of unresolved tension surfaced all at once. From the outside, the wedding looked monumental. Hundreds of guests, extreme security, celebrity attendance, and coverage that mirrored a royal event more than a private ceremony. But behind that scale, something was already off. Insiders would later describe the atmosphere as uneasy, marked by power struggles that had little to do with celebration. One of the earliest controversies centered on the wedding dress. Publicly, the narrative was simple. Nicola wore a custom couture gown developed over an extended period with an iconic fashion house, complete with multiple fittings and international coordination. Privately, Brooklyn would later claim something very different. According to him, Victoria had initially offered to design the dress herself, only to withdraw at the last moment, forcing Nicola into a sudden scramble. What made this claim explosive was how sharply it contradicted what had already been documented about the dress's year-long creation process. The contradiction immediately raised questions about timelines, motives, and whether this was miscommunication, resentment, or something deeper. But the dress was only the beginning. As the wedding plans unfolded, Brooklyn alleged that his parents repeatedly pressured him to sign away the rights to his own name before the ceremony. Not after, not eventually, before. He described it as a business demand disguised as family expectation, one that would affect not just him, but his future wife and children. When he refused, he claims the dynamic shifted permanently. The tone changed, the warmth disappeared, and from that point forward, he says, he was no longer treated the same. The emotional stakes escalated further during seating arrangements and pre-wedding discussions. Brooklyn stated that arguments erupted over who was considered real family, including objections to honoring long-standing caregivers by placing them at the couple's table. According to him, the issue wasn't logistics, but symbolism. Who mattered, who was visible, and who held priority. The language he later described was harsh, personal, and deeply cutting, especially on the eve of what should have been the happiest day of his life. Then came the moment that would dominate headlines and fracture public opinion: the dance. One account described a planned romantic moment between Brooklyn and Nicola being overtaken when Brooklyn was called to the stage and redirected into dancing with his mother instead. Brooklyn would later say the experience left him humiliated, claiming the interaction crossed emotional boundaries in front of hundreds of guests. Another account, offered by attendees, painted a very different picture, suggesting the dance happened later in the evening, after formal traditions were complete, during a casual portion where multiple family members were dancing freely. Two versions of the same moment, one deeply traumatic, one entirely ordinary. What made the situation impossible to resolve was the absence of clarity. With hundreds of guests, professional videographers, and extensive documentation, the lack of publicly released footage only intensified speculation. Each side seemed to be telling a truth that could not coexist with the other, and without visual confirmation, the narrative split cleanly down the middle. Supporters of Brooklyn saw control and emotional intrusion. Supporters of Victoria saw exaggeration and misinterpretation fueled by resentment. After the wedding, the distance became impossible to ignore. Social media unfollows, missed birthdays, and unexplained absences replaced the once constant public displays of unity. Brooklyn and Nicola were notably absent from David's milestone birthday celebration, an omission that sparked widespread discussion. According to Brooklyn, attempts to see his father privately were repeatedly rejected unless they occurred in highly public, camera-heavy environments, and even then, only under conditions that excluded Nicola. For him, this confirmed what he already feared: image was being prioritized over reconciliation.
As these fractures widened, tabloid stories began to circulate, often anonymous, often contradictory, and frequently casting Nicola as the controlling force pulling Brooklyn away from his family. Brooklyn would later reject that narrative entirely, claiming it was a familiar tactic used to preserve the family's public image by redirecting blame. He described a pattern where private disagreements were transformed into press narratives without his consent, reinforcing a version of events that left him isolated and unheard. By this stage, the conflict was no longer just about a wedding or a disagreement between in-laws. It had become a battle over autonomy, identity, and control of the story itself. Brooklyn was no longer simply the eldest Beckham child. He was positioning himself as someone who had spent his entire life inside a managed reality and was now questioning whether that reality had ever been built for him at all.
When Brooklyn finally spoke publicly, the tone wasn't explosive or theatrical. It was controlled, deliberate, and strikingly restrained for someone accused of airing family drama. He stated that he had stayed silent for years, making repeated efforts to keep everything private, but claimed that ongoing media leaks left him with no alternative but to speak for himself. What stood out wasn't just what he said, but what he emphasized, that this wasn't about revenge, exposure, or public sympathy. It was about reclaiming his voice for the first time. Central to his statement was the idea of narrative control. Brooklyn alleged that throughout his life, stories about the family had been carefully managed, with performative social media posts and curated appearances used to maintain a flawless image. According to him, this didn't stop when conflict emerged. Instead, he claimed the same machinery was used to discredit his wife, frame him as manipulated, and preserve the illusion of unity at all costs. In his words, the family brand came first, even when it meant sacrificing private truth. One of the most revealing aspects of his statement was how deeply it connected control to anxiety. Brooklyn described growing up with overwhelming emotional pressure, explaining that his anxiety only began to subside after distancing himself from his family. That detail reframed the entire situation. This was no longer just a dispute between parents and an adult child. It became a conversation about the psychological toll of growing up in a household where identity, success, and affection were tied to performance. He directly rejected the idea that Nicola was controlling him, calling the accusation backwards. Instead, he positioned his marriage as the first relationship in his life where he felt genuinely autonomous. He described choosing peace over proximity, privacy over visibility, and emotional safety over approval. For the first time, he wasn't being managed, shaped, or redirected, and that, he implied, was intolerable to a system built on access and influence. Brooklyn also claimed that attempts at reconciliation were conditional. According to him, contact with his parents was only encouraged when it could happen publicly, in environments that reinforced the family's image. Private meetings were allegedly delayed, restricted, or denied outright. Even then, he said, those moments often excluded Nicola, reinforcing the idea that acceptance was contingent on compliance. The message, as he experienced it, was clear: family love came with terms. What makes this situation especially complex is that no single version of events can be conclusively proven from the outside. There are conflicting accounts, missing footage, unnamed sources, and deeply personal interpretations of the same moments. But the absence of certainty doesn't erase the emotional reality Brooklyn described. Whether every detail aligns perfectly or not, the pattern he outlined reflects a broader issue within high-profile families where boundaries blur between personal life and public enterprise. This is where the story stops being just about the Beckhams and starts becoming about celebrity culture itself. When families become brands, children are no longer just children. They become extensions of legacy, assets within a narrative, and symbols that must remain aligned with public expectation.
Independence isn't encouraged quietly, it's negotiated. And when someone steps away, the system reacts not with understanding, but with damage control. Brooklyn's statement didn't demand forgiveness, nor did it ask for validation. It asked for distance, for the right to build a life that isn't shaped by image, press cycles, or performance. Whether time will soften these fractures remains unknown, but what is clear is that the illusion of perfection has cracked, and what's underneath isn't scandal, it's a family struggling with the cost of living publicly for too long. In the end, this isn't a story about villains or heroes, it's about power, identity, and what happens when love becomes conditional on visibility. And once that realization sets in, stepping away stops looking like rebellion and starts looking like survival.